My name is Hannah, and I'm 34 years old. For the past 5 years, I've been working at the National Archives and Records Administration. It's a job I've always enjoyed, surrounded by history and important documents. But lately, I've been feeling like something's missing in my life. I lost my parents when I was in my early 20s. It was a car accident, sudden and devastating. Since then, I've been on my own, throwing myself into my work and trying not to think about how lonely I felt. But as I approached my mid-30s, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I wanted a family of my own. "Hannah, you coming to the break room? We're having cake for Jim's birthday," my colleague, Lisa, called out. As I followed Lisa to the break room, I couldn't help but notice how she kept glancing at her phone, probably texting her husband. I felt a pang of envy. The break room was crowded with my coworkers, all chatting and laughing. Jim, a balding man in his 50s, was cutting the cake. "Here you go, Hannah," he said, handing me a slice. "You know, my nephew's about your age. Single too. Maybe I should introduce you to?" I forced a smile. "Thanks, Jim, but I'm okay." This wasn't the first time a coworker had tried to set me up. I'd been on a few dates with guys from work, but they all seemed, well, not what I was looking for. Too focused on their careers, or too immature. I wanted someone stable, someone who understood the value of family. Later that day, as I was organizing some files, my supervisor, Mr. Johnson, approached my desk. "Hannah, I've got a new case for you. A farmer from upstate is looking for information on a neighboring plot. Says it's abandoned and he wants to buy it. Think you can handle it?" I nodded. "Of course, Mr. Johnson. I'll get right on it." "Good. He'll be coming in tomorrow morning. His name's Daniel Miller." As Mr. Johnson walked away, I couldn't help but feel a little excited. A farmer. That was different from our usual clients. I wondered what he'd be like. The next morning, I arrived at work earlier than usual. I'd spent extra time on my appearance, though I tried to convince myself it was just another day. As I settled at my desk, my colleague Lisa gave me a knowing look. "Someone's looking nice today," she teased. "Hot date?" I rolled my eyes. "No, just meeting a new client. A farmer looking for property records." Just then, Mr. Johnson appeared with a man I assumed must be Daniel Miller. My jaw nearly dropped. This was not the old, bearded farmer I'd imagined. Daniel was tall, probably in his early 40s, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes. He wore jeans and a plaid shirt, looking somewhat out of place in our office full of suits. "Hannah, this is Mr. Miller," Mr. Johnson introduced us. "He'll be working with you on finding those property records." Daniel extended his hand. "Please, call me Dan." "It's nice to meet you, Hannah." His handshake was firm, his hands calloused from hard work. I felt a flutter in my stomach that I quickly tried to squash. "Nice to meet you too, Dan. Shall we get started?" As we settled into my workspace, I couldn't help but notice how Dan's presence seemed to fill the room. He had a quiet confidence about him that was intriguing. "So, tell me about this property you're interested in," I prompted, trying to keep things professional. Dan leaned forward, his eyes lighting up. "It's the plot next to my farm. Been abandoned for years. I'm hoping to expand, maybe start an orchard. But first, I need to track down the owners." As he spoke, I found myself drawn in by his passion. It was refreshing to see someone so enthusiastic about their work. We spent the next few hours poring over old property records. Dan was surprisingly knowledgeable, asking insightful questions that made our search easier. As we worked, we fell into an easy conversation. "So, how long have you been farming?" I asked during a lull. Dan's face softened. "Born and raised on a farm. Took over from my dad about 15 years ago. It's not always easy, but I love it." There was something in his tone that made me curious. "Sounds like there's a story there." He hesitated for a moment. "Well, it's just me and my boys now. My wife, she passed away a few years back. My heart clenched. I'm so sorry, Dan. That must be hard. He nodded, a sad smile on his face. It is. But my boys, they keep me going. They're 7 and 5 now. Great kids. I felt a wave of sympathy wash over me. I lost my parents years ago. I know it's not the same, but I understand loss. The rest of the day flew by. We made good progress on the property search, but it was clear we'd need more time. As Dan was leaving, he hesitated. Listen, Hannah. I know this is unconventional, but would you like to grab a coffee sometime? To discuss the case, of course. I felt my heart skip a beat. I'd like that, Dan. For the case, of course. Over the next few weeks, Dan and I met regularly, ostensibly to work on his property case. But our conversations often strayed beyond land records and legal documents. I found myself opening up to him in a way I hadn't with anyone in years. One day, as we were wrapping up our work, Dan hesitated. Hannah, I hope I'm not overstepping, but would you like to come out to the farm this weekend? Meet the boys? We're having a little barbecue, nothing fancy. My heart raced. This felt like a big step. I'd love to, Dan. Are you sure the boys would be okay with it? He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. They've been asking to meet you. I may have mentioned you once or twice. That Saturday, I found myself driving out to Dan's farm. The city gradually gave way to rolling hills and open fields. As I pulled up to the farmhouse, I saw Dan and 2 young boys waiting on the porch. Hannah, Dan called out, waving. Come meet the boys. I stepped out of the car, suddenly nervous. The younger boy hid behind Dan's leg, while the older one eyed me curiously. Boys, this is Miss Hannah from the archives. Hannah, these are my sons, Jack and Tommy. Jack, the older boy, stepped forward. Do you really work with old stuff all day? That's cool. I laughed, feeling myself relax. I do. Maybe I can show you some interesting documents sometime. Tommy, still shy, peeked out from behind Dan. Do you like chickens? We have chickens. And just like that, the ice was broken. The boys led me on a tour of the farm, showing me their favorite spots and introducing me to various animals. Dan followed behind, a soft smile on his face. As the day went on, I found myself falling into an easy rhythm with Dan and the boys. We grilled burgers, played catch in the yard, and ended the evening roasting marshmallows over a small fire. As the boys dozed off on a blanket nearby, Dan and I sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out. Thank you for today, I said softly. It's been wonderful. Dan turned to me, his face serious. Hannah, I need to be honest with you. I like you. A lot. And I think you might feel the same. But I need you to understand, the boys and I, we're a package deal. It's not always easy, being a single dad and a farmer. I took a deep breath, gathering my courage. Dan, I like you too. And your boys are amazing. I know it won't be easy, but I'd like to see where this goes. If you want to, that is. Dan's face broke into a wide smile. He reached out, taking my hand in his. I'd like that very much, Hannah. The months that followed were like a dream. Dan and I grew closer, and I found myself spending more and more time at the farm. The boys, Jack and Tommy, warmed up to me quickly, and I discovered a maternal instinct I never knew I had. One crisp autumn evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Dan turned to me with a serious expression. Hannah, these past 6 months have been the happiest I've had in years. I know it might seem fast, but when you know, you know. Hannah Thompson, will you marry me? Tears welled up in my eyes. Yes, Dan. Yes, I'll marry you. The wedding was a simple affair, held on the farm with only our closest friends and family present. As I walked down the makeshift aisle in a simple white dress, I saw Dan waiting for me, looking handsome in his suit. Jack and Tommy stood beside him, beaming. However, my joy was slightly dampened when I overheard Dan's parents talking during the reception. "She's awfully thin, isn't she?" his mother muttered. "Not sure she's cut out for farm life." "Give her time, Martha," his father replied. "She'll toughen up or she'll break." I tried to shake off their words, focusing instead on the happiness of the day. But a seed of doubt had been planted. After the honeymoon, I moved to the farm permanently. It was a big adjustment, leaving my job and city life behind. Dan suggested I quit working to focus on the house and children, and I agreed, eager to embrace my new role as wife and stepmother. At first, everything seemed perfect. I threw myself into farm life, learning to cook hearty meals, tend to the vegetable garden, and even help with some of the lighter farm work. The boys seemed to thrive under my care, and I loved reading to them at night and helping with their homework. But as weeks turned into months, I began to feel the strain. The work was endless and grueling. I'd never realized how much physical labor went into running a farm. My hands, once soft from office work, became calloused and rough. Dan's parents, who lived nearby, were frequent visitors. His mother, Martha, took every opportunity to criticize my efforts. "You call this a proper farm breakfast?" she'd scoff at my attempts at cooking. "In my day, we'd have had 3 different kinds of meat on the table by now." I tried to brush off her comments, but they stung. Dan, busy with the farm work, seemed oblivious to my struggles. One particularly difficult day, as I was struggling to wrangle a stubborn cow into the barn, Dan called out from the tractor. "Come on, Hannah, put your back into it. Food doesn't just appear on the table, you know." I bit back a retort, feeling a mix of frustration and hurt. This wasn't the life I had imagined when I said "I do." That night, as I looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. I'd lost weight, my hair was a mess, and there were dark circles under my eyes. The manicured nails and styled hair of my city life seemed like a distant memory. As the months wore on, the demands of farm life began to take their toll. I was up before dawn each day, preparing breakfast for Dan and the boys, packing lunches, and then diving into a never-ending list of chores. Feeding animals, cleaning coops and stalls, helping with the crops, it was relentless. One particularly grueling day, I woke up feeling awful. My head was pounding, and I could feel a fever coming on. But as I lay in bed, contemplating calling in sick, to whom, I wasn't sure, I heard a sharp knock at the bedroom door. "Hannah, are you planning to sleep all day?" It was Martha, my mother-in-law. I groaned, forcing myself to sit up. "I'm not feeling well, Martha. I think I might have a fever." She burst into the room, her face a mask of disapproval. "Nonsense. In this family, only death is an excuse not to work. Now get up and make me some breakfast. Then there's work to be done in the yard." Stunned and feeling too weak to argue, I dragged myself out of bed. As I mechanically prepared Martha's breakfast, I could feel my body protesting every movement. "Here you go," I said, placing a plate of eggs and bacon in front of her. She took one bite and grimaced. "Overcooked. But it'll have to do. Now get out there and earn your keep." I stumbled out into the yard, my vision blurry and my body aching. The world seemed to spin as I made my way to the chicken coop. As I bent down to clean it out, a wave of nausea hit me. I barely made it out of the coop before vomiting. Wiping my mouth, I looked up to see Dan watching me from the tractor. "You okay?" he called out. I shook my head weakly. "I think I'm sick, Dan. I need to lie down." He frowned. "We can't afford for you to be sick right now, Hannah. The work needs to get done. Just push through it." Tears stung my eyes as I watched him turn back to his work. I felt so alone, so unsupported. This wasn't the man I'd fallen in love with. That night, as I lay in bed, my fever raging, it was Jack and Tommy who took care of me. They brought me water and cold compresses, their little faces creased with worry. "Are you gonna be okay, Hannah?" Tommy asked, his voice small. I managed a weak smile. "I'll be fine, sweetheart. Thank you for taking care of me." As the boys left the room, I heard Dan's voice in the hallway. "Boys, leave Hannah alone. She needs to rest so she can get back to work tomorrow." In that moment, something inside me snapped. This wasn't the life I wanted. This wasn't the family I dreamed of. I needed to make a change. But just as I'd made this resolution, life threw me another curveball. A few weeks later, as I was getting ready for another day of endless chores, a wave of nausea hit me. But this time, it wasn't from illness. With shaking hands, I took a pregnancy test. As I waited for the results, my mind raced. A baby? Now? How could I handle a newborn on top of everything else? When the test showed positive, I felt a mix of joy and terror. I had hoped for some reprieve from the grueling farm work, but my expectations were quickly dashed. If anything, the demands on me seemed to increase. "You're eating for two now," Martha would say, piling more work on my plate. "That means you should be working for two as well." I was 7 months along when Dan's father approached me one afternoon. "Hannah, we need to clear out the old storage room for the baby. Get to it, will you?" Exhausted and aching, I nodded silently and made my way to the cluttered room. As I sorted through years of accumulated junk, I came across a dusty old box tucked away in the corner. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. Inside, I found a leather-bound book. As I flipped it open, my heart nearly stopped. It was a diary belonging to Marie, Dan's first wife. I knew I shouldn't read it, but something compelled me to do so. As I began to read, tears started streaming down my face. Marie's words painted a picture of a life not unlike my own: endless work, constant criticism, and a husband who seemed oblivious to her struggles. But as I read on, the entries became darker. "The pain is unbearable," one entry read. "I begged Dan to take me to a doctor, but he says we can't afford it. His parents say I'm just being weak. But I know something is wrong. I can feel it." My hands shook as I turned the pages. The final entry made my blood run cold. "I can't take it anymore. The pain, the work, the loneliness. They won't let me get help, won't even buy me medicine, because it's an unnecessary expense. I'm sorry, my sweet boys, but I can't go on like this. Dan, your parents, this is on you. I hope you can live with what you've done." I closed the diary, feeling sick to my stomach. This wasn't just a diary, it was a suicide note. Marie hadn't died from an illness as I'd been told. She had taken her own life, driven to desperation by the very people I was now living with. In that moment, everything became crystal clear. The way Dan and his parents treated me, their callousness towards my health and well-being, it wasn't new. They had done this before, and it had cost a woman her life. I carefully hid the diary in my room, my mind racing. I couldn't let history repeat itself. I couldn't become another Marie. 2 months had passed since I gave birth to my daughter, Emily. The joy of motherhood was overshadowed by the relentless demands of farm life. Night and day blurred together as I struggled to care for a newborn while still tending to Jack and Tommy, cooking meals, cleaning the house, and managing the endless chores that came with the animals. One afternoon, as I was hanging laundry outside, I heard raised voices coming from the barn. Curiosity and concern propelled me forward, and I crept closer to listen. "You killed her," Jack's young voice cracked with emotion. "You and Grandma and Grandpa, you killed Mom." The sharp sound of a slap echoed through the air, followed by Dan's furious voice. "Don't you dare say that again, boy. You think you're so smart, huh? Well, if you're too smart for your own good, maybe you don't need school anymore." My heart raced as I listened, frozen in place. Dan continued his tirade, his voice growing louder. "From now on, you'll work on the farm full-time. You'll earn your keep like the rest of us. You don't need an education to work here. You'll learn what really matters, how to put food on the table." I felt sick to my stomach. Jack was only 9 years old. The thought of him being denied an education, forced to work full-time on the farm, it was unthinkable. The next morning, Dan announced he was leaving for a 3-day farm produce fair with his parents. As soon as their truck disappeared down the driveway, I sprang into action. "Jack, Tommy," I called, my voice surprisingly steady. "Pack a bag with your favorite things. We're going on a trip." As the boys scrambled to pack, I gathered Emily's essentials and a few of our belongings. I retrieved Marie's diary from its hiding place and tucked it safely into my bag. Within an hour, we were in my old car, driving away from the farm. The boys were quiet, sensing the gravity of the situation. Emily slept peacefully in her car seat, oblivious to the turmoil around her. Using my meager savings, I rented a small apartment in the city. It was cramped and nothing like the farmhouse, but it was ours, and it was safe. The next day, I reached out to my old contacts at the archive. They were surprised to hear from me, but eager to help. With their assistance, I managed to track down information about Marie's parents. My hand shook as I dialed the number. A warm, elderly voice answered. "Hello? Mrs. Johnson? This is Hannah. I was married to your son-in-law, Dan." There was a pause, then a sharp intake of breath. "Is everything all right? We've been trying to get in touch with the boys for years. Dan cut us off after Marie, after we lost her. Please, can we see them?" It turned out the Johnsons lived in a neighboring town. They invited us to visit, eager to reunite with their grandchildren and meet Emily. The moment we arrived at the Johnsons' house, I felt a wave of warmth and acceptance wash over us. Marie's parents, Ellen and Robert, greeted us with open arms and tear-filled eyes. "Oh, look at you all," Ellen exclaimed, hugging Jack and Tommy tightly. "You've grown so much." Robert gently took Emily from my arms, cradling her with the practiced ease of a grandfather. "And this little one, she's beautiful, Hannah." Once we were settled inside, I knew it was time. With shaking hands, I pulled Marie's diary from my bag. "There's something you need to see," I said softly, holding out the diary to Ellen. As they read, their expressions changed from curiosity to horror to grief. Tears streamed down Ellen's face, while Robert's jaw clenched in anger. "We knew something was wrong," Ellen whispered. "But we never imagined, oh, Marie." Just then, my phone rang. It was Dan. I steeled myself and answered. "Where the hell are you?" he growled. "Get back home now, or I'm calling the police." I felt a surge of courage. "No, Dan. I'm not coming back. In fact, I'll be the one contacting the police. Don't call me again." I hung up, my heart racing. Over the next few days, with the Johnsons' support, I set our plan in motion. I contacted Child Protective Services, providing detailed accounts of the abuse and neglect the children had suffered. Then, clutching Marie's diary, I walked into the local police station. The detective listened gravely as I recounted everything: the forced labor, the medical neglect, Marie's suicide. "This is extremely serious," the detective said. "We'll need to investigate thoroughly. Are you willing to press charges?" "Yes," I replied without hesitation. "For all of us." What followed was a whirlwind of activity. Dan and his parents were arrested and brought in for questioning. The farm was searched, and more evidence of abuse was uncovered. The boys were interviewed by child psychologists, bravely recounting their experiences. It was heart-wrenching to hear their stories, but I was so proud of their courage. Finally, after months of legal proceedings, we found ourselves in the courtroom for the final verdict. I sat between Ellen and Robert, holding Emily close, with Jack and Tommy on either side of us. The judge's voice rang out clearly. "In light of the overwhelming evidence, this court finds the defendants guilty of child abuse, neglect, labor exploitation, and criminally negligent homicide in the death of Marie Johnson." I heard Ellen's sharp intake of breath beside me. The judge continued. "Daniel Miller is sentenced to 10 years in prison. His parents, Martha and George Miller, are each sentenced to 7 years." As the gavel came down, I felt a complex mix of emotions: relief, vindication, sadness, and hope. I looked at the boys, seeing a weight lift from their young shoulders. In the aftermath of the trial, our lives began to take on a new shape. Marie's parents were godsends. They opened their home to us, providing a safe haven as we navigated the choppy waters of our new reality. "Your family now, Hannah," Ellen said one evening, as we sat on their porch watching the kids play in the yard. "We're here for you, whatever you need." Their support was unwavering. They helped with childcare during the seemingly endless court proceedings and meetings with lawyers. Robert would often take Jack and Tommy fishing, giving them a chance to just be kids again. Ellen doted on baby Emily, singing her the same lullabies she once sang to Marie. With their encouragement, I hired a skilled divorce lawyer. The Johnsons insisted on covering the legal fees. The divorce proceedings were mercifully straightforward, given Dan's incarceration. When it was finalized, I was awarded full custody of all 3 children and substantial compensation from Dan's assets. As much as I appreciated the Johnsons' hospitality, I knew it was time for us to stand on our own feet. Using part of the settlement money, I rented a comfortable apartment in the city, close to my old workplace and a well-regarded school. The day I walked back into the National Archives felt like coming home. My colleagues welcomed me with open arms, and my boss was more than accommodating about my need for a flexible schedule. Enrolling the kids in school was a bittersweet moment. Jack and Tommy were excited but nervous, having been out of formal education for so long. Emily started at a nearby daycare. I'll never forget the lump in my throat as I watched them all head off that first morning, their backpacks seeming too big for their small shoulders. Ellen and Robert were frequent visitors, their presence a constant reminder that we weren't alone. They doted on all 3 children equally, showering them with the grandparental love they'd been denied for so long. One Sunday afternoon, as we all sat around the living room after a big family lunch, Robert cleared his throat. "Hannah, Ellen and I have been talking," he began, looking slightly nervous. "We've updated our will. We want you and the kids to be taken care of, no matter what happens." I was stunned. "But I'm not." Ellen reached out and squeezed my hand. "You're our daughter now, Hannah. And those are our grandchildren. We want to make it official." Tears welled up in my eyes as the magnitude of their gesture hit me. This was what family was supposed to be, unconditional love and support. As I looked around the room at the faces of my children and these 2 wonderful people who had embraced us so completely, I felt a sense of peace settle over me.